Hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Friday to you. Um, it's me, Rob, and we're gonna be talking about Haiti once again. So where were we? If you were here 2 weeks ago, I talked a little bit about the background of the colony of Saint Domingue, a French holding in what is now Haiti, the island of Hispaniola. You can see the map in front of you, the territory of Saint Domingue. Saint Domingue is the western part of Hispaniola, and the eastern part remained in control of or controlled by the Spanish, Santo Domingo, and would for most of the period that we're talking about. But the western part and by far the most profitable part of Hispaniola, the colony of Saint Domingue, is what you see before you. And if you'll take a look, you can see the island of Tortuga up near the top. And if you look very closely in the northwestern area, there's Gonaive, which is an important port. But the most important port, the most important city at the time, is in the northern province. It's called Le Cap or Cap Haitian. At one point, it's called Cap Republicain. They rename it all the time, but Le Cap is what we'll call it. Port-au-Prince is in the little crook down in the middle. One of the more important cities today in Haiti. Important at the time of the Haitian Revolution, but not its largest port. So bear this all in mind as we are talking about the Haitian Revolution going forward. There are three provinces of Haiti, or of Saint Domingue. There's the northern province, the western province, and the southern province. I believe that they have more significant designations, but we're just going to call them northern, southern, and western because that's what they're usually referred to, and that's the easiest way to remember where they are. The richest and most populous and most important was the northern province. That's where most of the sugar plantations were, all the richest coffee plantations, indigo, etc. The western and southern provinces were not worthless, but the vast majority of the cash crops were grown in the north. The southern province especially was a lot more rural and mountainous. And so when I talk about major occurrences, I'll try to be distinct about like where they're happening, but largely they are happening in the northern province. Okay. So when we left off the Haitian Revolution, we had just gotten to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which declared, among other things, that everybody was created equal. Sorry, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which declared all sorts of things. It had a bunch of articles, but Article 1, as we discussed, is that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good. Now, this is a very high and mighty proclamation. Sorry, I have another slide for you. Very high and mighty proclamation. A fine goal to advocate for. However, you may be surprised to hear that the absolute and full emancipation of all human beings was not actually the intent, or was not entirely considered by the members of the National Assembly and the drafters of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. I want to take a moment to dwell on the French Revolution itself before we delve deeper, because it's important to the way the Haitian Revolution continues on. I'll have to talk at length about the French Revolution itself at some point, but just know that France in the late 1780s was ruled by Louis XVI, a king, not a great king, not a terrible king, a pretty ineffective king, because all kings were really ineffective in one way or another in France at the time, because there were a lot of archaic rules and very complicated procedures that you had to follow to really do anything, and they hadn't been updated in centuries. One of the main problems was that the financial situation in France was pretty much untenable. Despite being the richest country in Europe, or close to, it was continually unable to pay its bills. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but to keep it really short and really simple, basically the nobility paid no taxes. They could not pay taxes, and they couldn't work. And they didn't work, but they literally were not allowed to. And this meant that most taxes were levied on either the growing bourgeoisie or, even more often, the peasants. And despite the fact that there was usually enough food to go around, there were constant and repeated bread shortages. Especially in the late 1780s, a lot of peasants became pretty fed up with the ancien regime. This is where you get the let them eat cake, the French nobility playing polo in their fancy dresses while people starve, which is exaggerated, and the let them eat cake thing is a mistranslation, but you know what I'm talking about. There's a reason that we associate this time period with excess and vast inequality, because it was a time of great inequality and great suffering for the majority of the French citizenry, who were rural peasants, farm workers, etc. So in 1787, because the French king could not pay his debts, it was suggested that he summon the Estates General, which had not been called since 1614. And this is in the understanding of sort of the French system of government, and also just sort of now it is a understanding of the distinctions in society under feudalism. But there was the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and everybody else, the third estate, the commoners. And so they were all gathered together for the Estates General. The idea was that the king could call the Estates General and then sort of get around the nobility, who were blocking all of his attempts to reform the finances of the kingdom. However, this did not go as the king had planned. In fact, the Estates General got pissed. There was a tennis court oath. They declared themselves the National Assembly, and essentially turned France into a constitutional monarchy for a little bit. Not for long, but for a little bit. Let's see. Am I looking at the right slide? Oops. Oh, getting ahead of myself. I don't have time to go into all of the different people involved with the French Revolution and the National Assembly, the Jacobins, the Girondists, all that. Someday. It's good stuff. But just know that there were some, or there was a not insignificant number of abolitionists and abolitionist-adjacent people involved with the National Assembly and a lot of the committees that were starting to remake French society during the Revolution. These societies were smaller and less powerful than the abolitionists in Great Britain and United States, but they had some influence. And the largest was called the Société des Amis des Noirs, Friends of the Blacks. And these were mostly white French men and women, but they opposed slavery, and they pushed for abolition during the Revolution. They were never particularly powerful, but they did have some influence in the assembly, and they were led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot. And in 1790, so a few years after the revolution itself begins, word had, or a year after the revolution begins, word had made it to Saint-Domingue, of course, and many of the free people of color, the gens de couleur, had started to wonder, well, why are we not considered free? Why do we not have the same rights that our fellow men in Paris do? Why are we not able to vote and form our own colonial assembly and advocate for ourselves? And many free men of color were propertied, and they owned plantations or slaves themselves. They were richer than many whites, the petit blancs. And so in their minds, and it made perfect sense, they could not see why they would not be considered free citizens, the same as their white planter brethren, especially in Saint-Domingue. And they continued to advocate for this outcome and were ignored. In the National Assembly, the white planters held a significant amount of power, and so they were continually pushing to not have this happen, to prevent the gens de couleur from receiving legal and political rights. But in 1790, there were revolts led by Vincent Ogé and a couple of other guys that really threatened the planter order and set a fire to the National Assembly. Combined with threats from the white planters to secede, declare independence, seek help from other nations. And so the National Assembly in March of 1790 approved a specialized colonial committee to deal with questions of the colonies. And it would deal with Saint-Domingue and Martinique and Guadeloupe and all that. And much of the conversation was about who would receive rights, who would be a citizen in the new French Republic. And what eventually happened was that in March, the Colonial Committee just punted. They said they put out a decree saying that all people who were property owners over 25 would be able to participate in the elections to form the Colonial Assembly in Saint-Domingue. The gens de couleur, the free people of color, had pushed very aggressively for them to clarify that it meant all property people, black, white, whatever. But the Colonial Committee assiduously resisted doing that. They decided that they were just going to not address the issue. And as racial violence was growing in Saint-Domingue, failing to address the issue turned out to be not a terrific plan. It did manage to avoid a fight in the National Assembly by failing to provide clear instructions, and it hoped by its own sort of logic that the planters would take advantage of the imprecision of the instructions and refuse the demands of the free people of color, which they were afraid to refuse themselves, that they would use the authority of the National Assembly to sort of clamp down on any crazy ideas of equality coming from the free people of color in Saint-Domingue. It was, according to one of the historians that I read, a cynical and cowardly political compromise, and in it were embedded the seeds of a brutal conflict. And that was absolutely the truth. Vincent Ogé and the other free coloreds who had risen up in 1790, their revolutions were crushed, they were executed, and ultimately this accomplished nothing except making everybody angry and punting the problem down the road. And not really very far, because in 1791, word of the revolution, word of the Declaration of Rights of Man, word of these new liberties that were being granted to people started to make their way to Haiti, to Saint-Domingue. And even though there were constant negotiations, constant discussions, the struggle for liberty was ongoing, right? There was the people who it affected the most, the slaves of Haiti, especially the African-born slaves of Haiti, were not going to wait for permission or for agreement or for their to be given their liberty. The word of freedom had already started to make its way into the slave plantations, and even though it was technically illegal to meet and organize slaves from other plantations, many of them would meet in at night in voodoo ceremonies or other religious gatherings, and they started to talk. They started to plan. And on the 14th of August, in a place called Bois Caiman, which is alligator forest, there was a ceremony, which you can see here. A voodoo ceremony led by Dudi Boukman, a enslaved African and a voodoo priest, and Cecile Fatiman, another priest. And this is a really interesting event. It, as described, involves the sacrifice of animals and dancing around a fire and all of these, what you might consider, traditional voodoo ceremony type things. According to the witness, this is what he writes about it. This meeting took the form of a voodoo ceremony in the Bois Caiman in the northern mountains of the island. It was raining and the sky was raging with clouds. The slaves then started confessing their resentment of their condition. A woman started dancing languorously in the crowd, taken by the spirit of the Loas. With a knife in her hand, she cut the throat of a pig and distributed the blood to all the participants of the meeting, who swore to kill all the whites on the island. So, Bois Caiman probably happened. This is a important historical event. But what's interesting to me about this is that the only witness that we have to this pivotal historical event is a white planter who, or somebody associated with the white planters. I've already forgotten his name because I forgot to write it down because I don't care. Who was not sympathetic to the revolution. And it seems pretty clear that he wrote this description of Bois Caiman to terrify and frighten and, enrage whites and to make the Haitian revolutionaries appear savage and cruel. It is unclear, not that it would matter, one way or another. Not that, sacrificing animals and dancing naked, who doesn't love that? But it does make me wonder whether or not how accurate this is to me, or how accurate this is of the event at hand. And ultimately, this is considered the launch of the Haitian Revolution, the beginning of it. And I don't want to go too deeply into talking about voodoo because it's a living religion and it's not really my place to talk about, but it is important to understand the role of sort of the syncretist faith in the revolution. A lot of the Haitian slaves came from different parts of Africa, and they formed this they developed this faith that was a combination of both indigenous and their own religions, and also some elements of Christian religion, and involved a lot of important symbols and traditions that bound the people of Haiti together as they were struggling against their oppressors. One of the really interesting examples of the syncretism comes from a description of a revolutionary who was found and executed by whites in this time, 1790, 1791. When they searched his body after his execution, they found pamphlets printed in France, filled with commonplaces about the rights of man and the sacred revolution. In his vest pocket was a large packet of tinder and phosphate and lime. On his chest, he had a little sack full of hair, herbs, and bits of bone, which they call a fetish. So he had on him, um, documents about liberation from France, what you need to make powder and fire a gun, and a voodoo fetish. And this combination of elements describes a lot of the impetus and the power behind the Haitian Revolution. These competing and or not competing, these different elements of Haitian culture that worked together, that bound the revolutionaries together as they tried to make things happen. I do think there is an X-Files episode on this. Absolutely, J. Biddy. I'm trying to remember which one it was. There's at least one about Haitian. I mean, there's at least one voodoo X-Files episode, but maybe multiple ones. So the revolution begins in earnest in 1791. Slaves, mostly in the northern province, starting with Bois Caiman, start to rise up. They kill their masters. They arm themselves. They take to the woods and to the hills. They gather together. They free other slaves. It is not every slave that is freed, but it is a substantial number of them. And before long, there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of slaves roaming free, slave insurgents roaming free and threatening the increasingly beleaguered white population of Saint-Domingue. They're still relatively unorganized at this point in time. They do not have a lot of arms or weapons or funding, and the small militias that are organized by the whites are still able to maintain some order, mostly in the cities. So the plantations are largely destroyed by the end of 1791. But in the West and the South, slaves are still not particularly well organized, and the slave insurgents don't yet have any sort of leadership or deep organization. They are still largely disorganized bands, but growing stronger, getting armed, and winning significant victories over the whites of Saint-Domingue. So, in the following year, in 1792, the National Assembly is struggling to get things under control everywhere, but especially in Saint-Domingue. And the strength of the insurgency, the growing power of radicals like Brissot in the National Assembly, and frankly, the just undeniable logic of the Free People of Color forced the Assembly's hand, basically, and they decided to grant civil and political rights to free men of color in the colonies on March of 1792. Now, the main reason that they want to do this, one reason why they want to do this, I'll give them a little bit of credit. Maybe they really did believe in equality. We'll see. Whatever. But a tactical reason why they did this was because the Free People of Color, the gens de couleur in Saint-Domingue, had made up a significant portion of the militias in Saint-Domingue and were basically the only troops they had capable of doing any fighting in the interior of Haiti, because it just had a habit of killing white people. And so if you wanted to put down the slave insurrections, you needed help from the Free People of Color. And so the way to do this was to offer them political and civil rights, which was, to the credit of the National Assembly and the burgeoning French Republic, entirely unprecedented and new in the history of the West at this point in time. Nobody anywhere else in the world had created any sort of colorblind republic. Clearly, it was not fully realized, but it was a very powerful move toward equality in a way that had not happened before. And as part of this, the Assembly's attempt to get things under control in Saint-Domingue, they appointed two new commissioners. Sonthonax, I love these guys so much. I want to get their names correct. Their names are, I want to get their full names. Where are you, buddy? Léger Félicité Sonthonax and Etienne Polverel. And these two guys were, like so many people in the French Revolution, not just happened to be in the right place at the right time. They had mostly been journalists and polemicists writing. They were not themselves abolitionists, though they were familiar with abolitionist ideas and sympathetic to them. And they were appointed by the National Assembly to get things under control in Saint-Domingue. There was a third commissioner, but he fucks off pretty quickly, and doesn't matter. Don't worry about him. Just remember Sonthonax and Polverel. Sonthonax would ultimately be granted control of the northern province, and then Polverel would be in control of the western and southern provinces. And they were sent by the Assembly in summer of 1792, and they had all the power to suspend or dissolve any existing colonial assemblies and take all measures necessary to apply the April 4th decree, the one granting equal rights to free men of color. They were also accompanied by 6,000 troops and a printing press. So they arrived to find that everything was a mess, that Saint-Domingue had tried to appoint its own all-white colonial assembly, that people were killing each other, free coloreds were killing whites, whites were killing free coloreds, slaves were killing both, etc. And so Sonthonax and Polverel show up and try to get things under control. Like I said, they were not abolitionists, and they were not sent there to free the slaves. Sonthonax declared when he arrived that the colonial assemblies were the only bodies with the right to rule on the lot of slaves, and that slavery was necessary to the cultivation and prosperity of the colonies. It is worth mentioning, though, that Sonthonax becomes pretty radical pretty quickly. Later on in an encounter with the reactionary French governor Giraud, Giraud? Sure, whatever. He says, "Understand, citizen, that the only thing white about me is my skin." So he definitely takes a turn toward radicalization somewhere in the course of his role as commissioner. But first, we must go back to France briefly, because more things are happening in France. In April of 1792, and the reasons for this are very complicated. It has to do with Marie Antoinette. It has to do with spreading the revolution, and it also has to do with weird anti-Austrian sentiment in France. But in April of 1792, France declares war on Austria and Prussia. This war immediately goes pretty poorly. They get their ass kicked in a bunch of different battles, and Prussia marches pretty much to the border. And then this document called the Brunswick Manifesto shows up, which says all sorts of things, but it threatens Paris with unforgettable vengeance should anyone oppose steps to restore the power of the monarchy. This makes the people justifiably angry. And on the 10th of August, again, because they believe the king to be friendly with the Austrians and the Prussians, a group of Parisian guards and provincial fédérés attack the Tuileries Palace. They kill a bunch of Swiss guards. Louis flees to the assembly, and then the assembly votes to temporarily relieve the king, effectively suspending the monarchy. This ends the period of a French constitutional monarchy and the beginning of a true French republic. The French managed to turn things around with the Prussians at Valmy, and riding the high of kicking Prussian ass, the convention, which had replaced the assembly, replaces the monarchy with the first French republic, introduces the new calendar, and declares 1792 year one. They then put citizen Louis Capet, formerly Louis XVI, on trial, and using the Brunswick Manifesto and some of his personal correspondence that showed him to be conspiring with royalist exiles in the Prussian and Austrian armies, they condemn him to death on January 17th of 1793 for conspiracy against public liberty and general safety. Louis XVI was executed on the 21st of January on the Place de la Révolution, which is now the Place de la Concorde. Here's to Louis XVI, a very average king. Sorry, buddy. Seriously, though, Louis XVI, it's worth noting, was not a particularly bad king. He wasn't a particularly good king. He wasn't, as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert on the French Revolution or the monarchy, but based on my understanding of it, not especially evil, not especially cruel. Many people suffered and died while he was king, but like everybody else, he was just sort of like bound to the rapidly decaying structure of the Ancien Regime. I'm generally opposed to capital punishment, as much as I might like to make guillotine jokes, but monarchs can always just abdicate. They could just give up their throne. I'm just saying, if you don't want to get guillotined, just stop being king. Anyway, that's the end of the French monarchy for now. And the result of this is that everybody in Europe is really mad at France for killing their king. That makes the other kings very upset and angry. And so all the other kings declare war on France. And so in February of 1793, France, already at war with Austria and Prussia, is now at war with Britain, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Tuscany in what we now call the War of the First Coalition. This is, as you might imagine, not good news for France. That's a lot of people to be at war with. And this war immediately takes on an international character. This is Valmy, the Great Victory. And one of the main areas of conflict is, of course, Saint-Domingue. Now, remember that I mentioned Spain back there. I'm sure you've all been paying attention. If not, let's go back to our very first slide. The other half of the island of Haiti, this pink part, is controlled by Spain. So, Spain, which had already been providing some aid to slave insurgents to sort of just like protect their national interests, goes all out on arming and providing supplies to the slaves that had taken to the slave insurgents that had taken to the mountains in the central area, putting up to as many of 10,000 of them under arms. Slaves are found with Spanish cannons and Spanish supplies throughout this period. And simultaneously, that very same month, a group of French planters in London draw up a detailed proposal offering to transfer their allegiance to the British government in return for protection and a suspension of debts. The British agree to intervene. The William Pitt the Younger, prime minister at the time, believed that the success of the slave revolt would inspire insurrections in British colonies, and so did not want that to spread. He also thought that if the British could take Saint-Domingue, it would be a useful bargaining chip when time came to negotiate peace with France, and that the great wealth of Saint-Domingue could be diverted to Great Britain. So he, or through his Secretary of State for War, the Viscount Melville, instructed Sir Adam Williamson, the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, to sign the agreement with the French colonists, which promised to, among other things, restore the Ancien Regime, slavery, and remove rights from free people of color. This made a lot of people angry. Again, most notably everybody who was fighting in Saint-Domingue, but also abolitionists in England. And in September of that year, hundreds of red coats landed at Jérémie on the edge of the southern province, They were greeted by residents who cried, "Long live the English!" And they soon controlled much of the southern and western province. So right away, a lot of slaves join with the Spanish, and because the Spanish offered them essentially freedom, and had been fighting under a French banner for a while, or sorry, a Spanish banner for a while, and though most of the slaves remained independent, or nominally independent, an increasingly large number allied themselves with the Spanish. The early leaders of the insurgents, men like Jean-François Papillon, Georges Bissot, and a man named Toussaint, who we will come back to later, all fought for the Spanish in sort of the interior part of Saint-Domingue, because the French continued to resist the push or the urge or the calls for liberty. Both the slaves themselves were advocating for peace. They were constantly trying to negotiate liberty for themselves. Free people of color were trying to negotiate limited emancipation. But the white planters continued to resist this at every turn. Sonthonax and Polverella are becoming increasingly sympathetic to these ideas because, they're getting their ass kicked by multiple different. Sorry, give me a second. I lost my thing. Multiple different nations in this war of the First Coalition, and they're having trouble justifying the fight against emancipation, but they continue to fight against it for a little while longer. And in the summer of 1793, the pro-planter governor, Galbaud, who had constantly been fighting with Sonthonax and Polverel over various things, trying to advocate for white rights in Haiti, was arrested by Sonthonax and Polverel on suspicion of sedition. He was put on a brig in the harbor, but he managed to find some supporters. He raised an army and attacked Le Cap with the intent of deposing both commissioners. Sonthonax and Polverel managed to escape, but things were going very badly in Cap Français. As you can see, it was burning. Hard to say who started the fire. Some say that it was the people fighting with Galbaud. Some say it was the free people of color. Some people say it was the slaves. But in any case, Le Cap started burning. And in order to sort of recapture the city, Sonthonax and Polverel made a declaration, which said, among other things, that it was the will of the French Republic and all of its delegates to grant freedom to all black warriors who would fight for the Republic. They announced also that it is kings who want slaves, and that it is the kings of Guinea who sell them to white kings. The French nation was committed to shattering all chains. This had the effect of gaining them some fighters and some additional help among the insurgent slaves in the interior. But this was the same as what the Spanish had already offered the insurgent slaves, so it did not immediately turn the tide. So Polverel goes a little bit further, issuing a proclamation in August saying that those who own nothing should not have to sacrifice their lives for the defense of the property of others. These warriors deserved more than just freedom, they deserved land. And he announced that he would distribute state-owned land seized from planters among the good and loyal Republicans, whether insurgent Africans or Spanish defectors who fought for the defense of the colony. Still not having the support that they need, Sonthonax, in August of this year, issues a decree that abolishes slavery entirely for the entire northern province, effectively ending slavery for the large majority of uh, slaves in Saint-Domingue, the first sort of decree of its kind. And this was met with excitement and celebrations. One insurgent named Bramante Lazari wrote, "Our flag makes clear that our liberty depends on three colors, black, mulatto, and white. We are fighting for these three colors. All the races of Saint-Domingue were to form one family and fight those who are against our liberty, against the aristocrats and the Spanish who flew the white flag of royalism, who wanted only the white, and who hoped for return to the old order. All should rally and proclaim, no, we are French, and we want to live free or die." Polverel would do the same thing in the coming months. And then, following suit, inspired by and essentially forced by the events that were happening in Saint-Domingue, the National Convention in 1794 included an endorsement that abolished slavery in the entirety of France, that slavery of the blacks is abolished in all colonies. Consequently, it decrees that all men living in the colonies, without distinction of color, are French citizens and enjoy all the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. So, I don't know about you, but I didn't learn anything about this when I was learning about, any of American history, but also world history or the history of slavery or emancipation. But as you probably know, this proclamation, this French Constitution that abolishes slavery, doesn't stick. In a few years, Napoleon will come back and reinstitute slavery, and then we have some more cool stuff to talk about. But this is a really significant moment. Obviously, this is in the modern era, an incredible moment of true commitment to egalitarianism, a huge coup for enslaved people everywhere, and a victory for abolitionists, and one of the moments of true commitment to the ideals of the Enlightenment. But what's so interesting about it, and what I want to talk about briefly when I want to sort of stop on this, is that it seems very clear that rather than the National Assembly deciding, Thomas Paine wrote the book, and there's a constitution, and so we've got to free the slaves. The slaves freed themselves. The slaves rose up, and they forced the people of Saint-Domingue and then the people of France to recognize their shared humanity, their own ability and right to advocate for themselves, and their power as working people and as fighters. They essentially won their own freedom. Now, yes, it came from the National Assembly, but it came because the reality of the situation could no longer be denied. The people of Saint-Domingue had fought and won the right to be recognized as equal citizens. And then the legal justification came after. And the Haitian Revolution remains an incredibly important and significant event in the history of emancipation. And the fact that we don't talk about its role in pushing abolitionists here and elsewhere to be more radical and to forcing people to recognize the rights and the humanity of enslaved people, I forgot how I started this sentence. Anyway, the fact that we don't talk about that is absolutely unconscionable in my mind, and also a great disservice to people who really want to understand history. And so I'm going to stop here for tonight because there's a lot of history, a lot of Haitian Revolution still to talk about, but I think this is a really, really important moment in history, and I think it's a critical part of the Haitian Revolution. that in just a couple of years, simply by banding together, rising up, refusing to take the, you know, the bare minimum that was offered to them by the French leadership, the people of Haiti went from being enslaved, 500,000 men and women in chains, to being fully free. Now it would take another 7 years and then some, maybe 10 years. It would take another 10 years before the people of Haiti truly achieved freedom. But I think this is a very, very significant moment and a very, very important moment in the history of the world and the history of black rights, of equal rights for everybody, of democracy in general. JVD asks how influential it was on American abolitionists. I will talk about that some maybe next time, whenever I get to the end. It is not well studied in American history textbooks, but it was very influential, mostly in the sense that it terrified the shit out of every white person in America, and made the argument for abolition a lot more agreeable. But I will talk about that more in some detail later. So thank you all for coming and listening to me talk about Haiti. I'm not going to apologize for how long it's taking me to get through the revolution. I hope you're all enjoying yourselves. Stay frosty out there. Get vaccinated. Have a good time. Love you all. Happy Friday and good night.